Hey guys, it's Madison, and this is going to be just a very kind of casual, chatty video about what the heck went on this spring and why it was both a very bad time for my language learning, but also very good in some other ways as well for my language learning. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So if you recall back to the beginning of this year, I had the plan to do kind of monthly recaps for my language learning each month, and clearly that has not held up throughout the course of this year, but I do want to have just the record of how things went throughout the year, and so I am going to kind of catch up in one fell swoop today, at least for March, April, and May. I'll do June in my next video, but yeah, this spring definitely became kind of a whirlwind for me, which obviously affected how much I could post here and also my language learning. So let's go ahead and jump into why it was a whirlwind and why it was so busy and crazy in a few aspects. What I'm going to do, I'm not going to really go in as much detail as I often do with my kind of charts and graphs. This time I'm just going to kind of put up the total time and just the active or focused time, which is like reading or active listening, active speaking, that kind of stuff, for each of my languages briefly on the screen, and then kind of talk more generally about how that month went and what happened in the month without really getting into too much number analyzing per se this time. So starting with March, I was coming into March after a disappointing few months in January and February just because I had a lot of time in those months, like free time, because it was primarily just vacation time before starting back for the spring semester, and I felt like I didn't achieve as much as I could have during those months, and so I was really motivated and really kind of driven coming into the month of March and thought, this is it, this is the time where I'm really going to jumpstart my language learning and really start ramping up the amount of time I spend on my language learning. And so just like the previous 2 months, I went ahead and made a bingo card for the month of March because I was so motivated and I really had the goal to do a lot of reading stuff in particular in that month. I went ahead and made it a bigger bingo card than normal. I had 25 squares rather than 16, and I made a majority of those squares reading focused and stuff, and I was just really, really determined to do a lot and accomplish a lot for my reading skills, especially in Korean, in the month of March. Now, did that happen? No, which is why I'm not even going to show the card at this point because it was just a bunch of failures basically, and there's no point in just pointing out how many different ways I failed in that month. But basically what happened in the month of March, I'll go ahead and show the kind of overall and active time charts on the screen now. And as you can see, there's not a huge difference between those charts. Most of the stuff I did in language learning that month was active stuff, which is great. I started off the month pretty consistent in all 3 languages each day, but that kind of petered off a little bit as the days went on. This is also the month where I kind of tested myself in my Japanese level by taking the N5 and N4 and then eventually the N3 test as well. And then in the 3rd full week of March, I did the 40-hour language learning challenge. And that challenge was kind of a turning point in the spring for me. I'll put the link to the challenge up in the card so you can watch it if you want to for kind of the full backstory on how that week went. But basically, I went into the week catching a minor cold, which thankfully didn't last more than just a few days, and so it didn't really impact my language learning for the week. But by the end of that week, I was just so burnt out. And that really kind of was the first of many dominoes that kind of ruined the rest of spring in some ways for my language learning. Coming into that challenge week, I already was feeling a bit disappointed in how kind of my very reading focused goals for the month of March were not being met already. And so I had really hoped to kind of make really good progress towards those goals in the challenge week. And because of the initial sickness and then just feeling burnt out at the end, I really didn't make much progress at all, the way I thought I would at least. And so that really strong burnout plus kind of the already existing disappointment in how I was kind of failing to achieve my goals once again just really left me kind of exhausted. And so the next whole week, kind of the end of the month, I did basically nothing. I watched a few shows in my languages and I did some swing dancing, but other than that, basically nothing at all for the rest of the month. And so obviously kind of the very overdriven, super motivated goals that I set at the beginning of the month ended up basically all being big failures. And so I finished off the month of March feeling very bad about my language learning. But the funny thing is, looking back in hindsight at this chart and the amount of hours that I actually accomplished towards my language learning, especially because of that challenge, it was actually a significant amount of stuff done. You know, not all that I'd hoped it would be, but still much stronger than the first 2 months of the year. And so it's kind of funny looking back, you know, with some time in hindsight to realize that how bad I felt was not actually proportionate to the things that I actually managed to achieve. It just wasn't what I kind of went into the month hoping to achieve, and so I felt bad at the end of the month. Moving on to April, and this is where my spring really takes a turn for the worse. I started April still kind of in that low energy kind of funk from the end of March. And then the first weekend of April, I actually had a super, super fun event. I had a swing dance workshop where I spent the entire weekend at kind of a conference center, spending literally all day in swing dancing workshops with professional international instructors, and then spending basically all night until like 2 a.m. at social dances dancing. And so that was extremely fun. Used a decent amount of Korean as well, but also so like physically and mentally draining because of spending like full days not only doing physical activity but also socializing and, you know, not being at home. And so it takes a lot of my little introvert's social energy to be interacting with strangers for a whole weekend, even though it was a super, super fun event. And so that was great. Did use a lot of Korean, did learn a ton of swing dancing, but then I came home and was once again totally and utterly exhausted, but had to get up and go to work the next morning. And so the next kind of whole week I spent recovering mentally and socially from that whole event. And then unfortunately that is around the time that I ended up catching a cold from one of my students. A lot of the students in my classes were kind of coughing and sniffling for the previous few weeks, and finally I fell victim to the same cold. And that unfortunately was basically the final downfall of my spring in terms of language learning, and especially making videos on this channel, because what I thought was going to be just a few days or maybe a week of being sick turned into being sick literally basically for 2 months. Thankfully, the kind of sickness it was not like me feeling terrible every single day, but basically the cough that I developed during that sickness did not go away for 2 months. And I think a huge reason for that is because my job is teaching. I have to basically talk all day in the classroom. And I think especially the way that I tend to talk is I project a lot when I speak, and so it's just terrible for the vocal cords in general when I have to talk all day, and then much less when my throat is suffering from a sickness. And so basically what started off as a simple little cold that I caught from my students ended up being like a full-scale bronchitis situation where I could barely speak without, you know, triggering a coughing fit essentially. And so obviously I couldn't really film anything during this time. I ended up even pulling a rib muscle, like an intercostal muscle, during a coughing fit that still is healing to this very day, literally 3 months later. So it was a rough few months. But basically because of that, you know, being exhausted and a little bit burnt out still at the beginning of the month, and then ending the month and then the whole next month basically with this sickness, I didn't really have a lot of leftover energy and motivation to put towards active language learning. And so basically all I did was still spend the weekends swing dancing when I felt up to it. And so I thankfully got a little bit of Korean exposure and speaking stuff in there when I was feeling okay. And then during the weekday evenings or my free time on the weekends, I started getting back into watching dramas as well, because again, I didn't have a ton of drive and mental energy to put towards more active stuff. And so I fell back into my habit of doing the easier stuff of just turning on a show and kicking back and relaxing while watching that instead, because it's a more low activity kind of thing. And I was really putting all my energy at that point into surviving the busyness of the semester, trying to spend all day talking, and then just having no energy left for other stuff really outside of that. So that's basically how that month went. Just swing dancing here and there when I had the time and energy, and then mostly just watching shows otherwise outside of that. And looking at the charts for May, basically the exact same thing applies for May. I started feeling better and thought I was basically healed from the, at that point, like 2 or 3 week illness. Thankfully, I felt good enough to go to another swing dancing workshop, this time in Busan for another weekend. But then unfortunately, a few days after that, I got like relapsed with another bout of the same throat bronchitis-y situation. And so it was yet another month of struggle. It was even busier at work, but I still had to try and work through my bronchitis-y coughing situation. Also at this time, I was following the Karen Reed trial in the States, and all that coverage was in English as well. And I was watching a lot of that. And so, you know, just in my free time, again, I just didn't have the mental energy, the physical energy, just any energy or motivation to really work on much beyond just watching a few dramas here and there, and then continuing to try and improve my swing dancing when I was feeling up to it again and not feeling too terrible. But yeah, that is basically the gist of why I mostly disappeared in the spring on this channel. What started out as burnout from the 40-hour 7-day language challenge turned into a full-blown throat illness, coughing illness, where I basically couldn't couldn't speak comfortably for basically 2 months. And so obviously that hindered the content that I could produce because it always involves speaking to some degree. And also during that time, I was really struggling to have a lot of energy to put towards like mentally engaging activities, which includes, filming videos and editing videos and such. And so I just really didn't have the energy or the voice to film much or just to do much in the way of languages regardless. And so that's why I was not here for several months on YouTube. But if you recall at the very beginning of the video, I did mention that this spring was not only bad for my language learning, but it also was very, very good in some ways. And so I did want to highlight kind of the positives that came out of this 3-month period as well. And basically, once again, it's all tied to swing dancing, which in some ways has really taken a lot of energy and time away from my language learning time, but in other ways has been excellent for my language learning. And so basically what I did this spring is I ended up joining multiple other kind of weekly activities for swing dancing that are much, much more language intensive for my Korean than my other original club was. And so because of that, even, during these times where I don't feel motivated to necessarily study by reading or, studying grammar or whatever other more traditional study method, I am still getting weekly exposure and interactions and active speaking, active listening practice in Korean. So that has been a really excellent development. And so since May, which is the time that I did sign up for these extra swing dance activities, not only have I been getting the active, listening, active speaking practice and interactions during the actual classes and social dances, but also these clubs happen to have like the most active group chat that I've ever seen, literally like dozens of texts every single day about the weather, about what they're eating for lunch, about just a bunch of different random things. And at first, I will admit it was a bit annoying to suddenly be thrown in these group chats that are super active because I'm not usually the kind of person who enjoys, being in 7 different group chats that are super, super high quantity of texts. But on the positive side, it has really increased the amount of Korean reading that I do every single day as well. So even when I don't have the, motivation to necessarily pull out a book or webtoon to reading Korean, I am still checking my texts every single day and catching up on the group chats and reading all those messages and actually learning quite a lot about how people text naturally and how they, abbreviate certain things. Because I've noticed that a lot of times when Koreans text me directly, they don't tend to use as much as their natural slang and natural like abbreviations or like cute or funny way of writing things that they would necessarily use with each other. And so I've been learning a lot by just observing the group chats. And so that has been a great benefit to my language learning despite, the low energy, long period of sickness and struggles that I had this spring. Not to mention, the social interactions and, sense of social belonging that I've also developed because of all this different club activity and stuff as well. So yeah, definitely not all bad this spring. There were some positive things, not only just for my life in general, but also for my language learning just because of those social interactions. So yeah, that is where I'll leave you for this video. The next video will be kind of a mixture of a vlog from the early days of June, along with kind of how my overall setting routines kind of monthly goal went for the month of June. Let me know in the comments below how your spring went. Hopefully you had a little less sickness and a little more language drive than I did this spring. But yeah, that is it for this video. I will see you guys in the next one, and until then, annyeong!